There was a room at Graceland that almost no one ever saw. It wasn't on the tours that would come later, after everything ended. It wasn't photographed for magazines or mentioned in interviews. The Memphis Mafia knew it existed, but they had learned not to ask questions about it. When Elvis disappeared into that room, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire nights, they understood that he had gone somewhere they could not follow. But that's not where this story begins. It begins with a man who had everything the world said he should want, and nothing that actually filled the emptiness inside him. It begins with grief that had no expiration date. It begins in the small hours of an October morning in 1974, when Elvis Presley walked through the halls of his own mansion like a ghost haunting the life he had built. Graceland at 3 in the morning was a different place than Graceland at 3 in the afternoon. During the day, the mansion hummed with activity. Staff members moving through their routines, friends and family filling the rooms with noise. The constant awareness that the most famous man in America lived here and the world was always watching. But at night, when the entourage had finally gone to bed and the security guards kept their distance, the house became something else entirely. It became quiet. It became honest. It became a place where a man could finally stop performing. Elvis moved through the darkness without turning on lights. He knew this house by heart. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in every corner, every step from the master bedroom to the kitchen to the music room to the place he was going now. He was wearing pajamas and a robe, his hair uncombed, his famous face bare of the careful grooming that cameras always captured. He looked in this moment like any other 40-year-old man, wandering his house in the middle of the night because sleep refused to come. He passed the living room where he had hosted presidents and movie stars. He passed the dining room where elaborate meals were served to people who came to Graceland, hoping to touch something legendary. He passed the trophy room where gold records lined the walls like monuments to a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. And then he reached the door. It was at the end of a hallway that most visitors never saw. A plain wooden door, painted the same color as the walls. Easy to overlook if you didn't know it was there. There was no sign on it, no indication of what lay beyond. Just a door, like any other door, leading to a room that contained everything Elvis Presley could not show the world. He opened it and stepped inside. The room was small, maybe 12 feet by 15, modest by Graceland standards. The walls were painted a soft blue, the color of the sky just before dawn. There was a single window, covered by heavy curtains that blocked out everything. The Memphis night, the security lights, the world that never stopped demanding pieces of him. Against one wall sat an old upright piano, nothing like the grand instruments in the music room upstairs. This one was scarred and worn, its finish dulled by decades of use. It had come from the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, Mississippi, the church where Elvis had first learned to sing, where his mother had taken him every Sunday when he was small, where he had discovered that his voice could make people feel things they couldn't name. The church had closed years ago, and Elvis had quietly arranged to have the piano brought to Graceland. He had never told anyone why. Some things didn't need explaining. Against the opposite wall was a simple bed, not the elaborate furniture that filled the rest of the house, but a narrow single bed with a metal frame and a thin mattress. It was the kind of bed you might find in a boarding house or an army barracks. Elvis had slept on a bed exactly like this one during his years in Germany, when he was just another soldier, when nobody screamed his name or reached for pieces of his clothing. Sometimes he came to this room just to lie on that bed and remember what it felt like to be ordinary. But the heart of the room was something else entirely. Along the far wall, arranged with careful precision, were photographs. Dozens of them, maybe 100. They covered the wall from floor to ceiling, some in frames, some simply pinned to the surface. A mosaic of faces and moments that told the story of a life the public never saw. There was his mother, Gladys, in photograph after photograph. Young Gladys, before the worry lines and the weight gain, laughing at something outside the frame. Gladys holding baby Elvis in front of the shotgun shack in Tupelo. Gladys standing proudly beside her teenage son when he bought her first real dress with money from his truck driving job. Gladys in the doorway of Graceland, looking small and overwhelmed by the mansion her son's success had purchased, and Gladys in the hospital, days before she died, her face pale and her eyes already looking somewhere far away. Elvis stood before that wall of photographs and let himself feel everything he couldn't feel anywhere else. In the public rooms of Graceland, he was Elvis Presley, the king, the legend, the man who had to smile and charm and perform even when visitors were supposed to be friends. In Las Vegas, he was the jumpsuit and the cape, the voice and the spectacle, the larger-than-life figure that 2,000 people came to worship every night. In Hollywood, he was whatever the script required him to be. But in this room, at 3 in the morning, with no one watching and nothing expected, he was just a son who missed his mother. He sat down at the old piano. His fingers found the keys automatically. Muscle memory from a lifetime of playing. He didn't play anything famous. Not the hits. Not the songs that had made him rich. Not the music the world associated with his name. He played the old hymns. The gospel songs his mother had taught him before he knew what music was. The simple melodies that had filled that little church in Tupelo when he was 5 years old. And the whole future was still unwritten. Peace in the valley, he sang softly, his voice rough and unpolished in a way it never was on stage. There'll be peace in the valley for me someday. His mother had loved that song. She had requested it at every church service, had hummed it while she cooked, had sung it to him when he was sick or scared or couldn't sleep. It was the last song he had sung to her, in that hospital room, holding her hand while her breathing grew shallow and the machines beeped their steady countdown. There'll be no sadness, no sorrow, no trouble I'll see. His voice cracked on the last line. He stopped playing. The silence of the room pressed in around him. The photographs watched from the wall. All those frozen moments, all those people he had loved, all that time that had passed without permission. How long had it been now? 16 years since Gladys died. 16 years of carrying grief that never got lighter, only more familiar. 16 years of performing joy for audiences, while something inside him remained permanently broken. He thought about the show he had done last week in Las Vegas. 8,000 people screaming his name. Standing ovations that seemed to last forever. Women throwing themselves at the stage. Men studying his moves. Everyone wanting something from him. A piece of his clothing. A moment of his attention. Proof that they had been in the presence of something larger than ordinary life. And through it all, he had felt nothing. That was the truth he couldn't tell anyone. The terrible, isolating truth that had driven him to build this room in the first place. The performances had become hollow. The adoration had become meaningless. He went through the motions because going through the motions was all he knew how to do. But the joy, the genuine, unforced joy that had once made him feel alive, had been missing for years. His mother would have known. She always knew when something was wrong with him, even before he knew it himself. She would have taken one look at his face and said, "What's troubling you, baby?" And he would have told her, because he could tell her anything, and she would have listened without judgment, and then said exactly the words he needed to hear. But his mother was gone, and no one else could reach the place where he actually lived. Elvis stood up from the piano and walked to the wall of photographs. His fingers traced the edge of one image, Gladys on her wedding day. Young and beautiful and full of hope, wearing a dress she had sewn herself because they couldn't afford to buy one. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Mama," he said quietly. "I got everything you said I'd get. The fame, the money, the big house, all of it. And I'd trade it all, every bit of it, for one more conversation with you." The photograph didn't answer. Photographs never did. He moved along the wall, letting his eyes rest on each image. There was his twin brother Jesse, who had died at birth, represented only by a single photograph of a tiny gravestone in a Mississippi cemetery. Elvis had never known Jesse, but he had felt his absence his entire life. The missing piece, the other half of himself that had never gotten the chance to exist. There were photographs of his father Vernon, young and strong in the early pictures, worn down by life in the later ones. Their relationship had always been complicated, love mixed with disappointment, respect mixed with resentment. Vernon had never quite known what to do with the son who had become larger than anything he could comprehend. There were photographs of Lisa Marie, his daughter, the only purely good thing he had managed to create. She was 8 years old now, living most of the time with Priscilla since the divorce. Every picture of her face was a reminder of what he was missing, the daily moments, the bedtime stories, the ordinary father-daughter life that his schedule and his fame made impossible. And there were other photographs too, people who had mattered to him along the way, the musicians who had played on his early recordings, the friends who had believed in him before anyone else did, the quiet moments between performances when he had been allowed, briefly, to be human. This wall was his real autobiography, not the official story, not the legend, not the carefully managed image that Colonel Parker had constructed over 2 decades. This was the truth, messy, painful, incomplete, the truth of a man who had been given everything except the things that actually mattered. There was a small table in the corner of the room. On it sat a Bible, his mother's Bible, the one she had read from every night, the one with her handwriting in the margins, and her prayers pressed between the pages. Beside it was a journal. Elvis sat down at the table and opened the journal. He had been keeping it for years, writing down thoughts he couldn't share with anyone, feelings he couldn't admit, questions that had no answers. The pages were filled with his handwriting, cramped and urgent, the words of a man trying to make sense of a life that had grown beyond his control. He picked up a pen and began to write. October 14th, 1974. 3 in the morning again. Can't sleep. The pills don't work anymore. Or they work too well. Or they work in ways that scare me. I don't know. Did 2 shows tonight. The crowd was good. They always are. They scream and they reach and they look at me like I'm something more than human. And I give them what they want, because that's all I know how to do. But I'm tired. Mama, I'm so tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind of tired that goes all the way down to the bone. The kind that makes you wonder what the point of any of it is. I have everything. Everything. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. A house that looks like a museum. People who do whatever I ask. And I would trade it all. Every gold record. Every screaming fan. Every dollar for one more morning in that little kitchen in Tupelo. Watching you make breakfast. Hearing you hum those old songs. Feeling like I belonged somewhere. I don't belong anywhere now. That's the truth. I can't say out loud. I belong to everyone, and therefore to no one. I am a thing that people own pieces of. I am whatever they need me to be. But in this room, at 3 in the morning, I am still your son. I am still the little boy who used to sit on your lap and listen to you sing. I am still the person you believed in before anyone else did. I hope that's enough. I hope somewhere, somehow, you know that I tried, that I took the gift you saw in me and did something with it, that I made you proud, even if the price was higher than either of us imagined. I love you, Mama. I miss you every day. Your son, Elvis. He closed the journal and sat in the silence. The room held him the way his mother used to hold him. Completely, unconditionally, without judgment. Here, he didn't have to be the king. He didn't have to be anything at all. He could just exist, breathing and grieving and remembering, a man alone with his thoughts and his ghosts. He stayed in that room until the first light of dawn began to seep around the edges of the curtains. Then he stood up, took one last look at the wall of photographs, and walked back out into Graceland, back into the world that demanded Elvis Presley, back into the performance that never ended. But he would return. He always returned, because this room, this small, secret, sacred space, was the only place where he could still find the person he used to be, the person his mother had loved, the person who existed before the fame and the fortune and the crushing weight of being a legend. Some rooms hold furniture. Some rooms hold memories. This room held Elvis Presley's soul. After Elvis died in August 1977, the people who cleaned out Graceland discovered the room. They found the piano from Tupelo, the photographs on the wall, the journal filled with late-night confessions. The journal was never published. The family decided it was too private, too painful, too revealing of the man behind the myth. But those who read it spoke of its contents with tears in their eyes. He was lonely, one of them said. The loneliest person I ever knew. But in that room, writing in that journal, talking to his mother's photograph. I think that was where he felt least alone. The room was eventually incorporated into Graceland's private areas, off limits to the millions of tourists who would walk through the mansion in the decades to come. They would see the jungle room and the music room and the trophy room lined with gold. They would see the evidence of fame and success and a life lived larger than most people can imagine. But they would never see the room where Elvis Presley went to be human. They would never see the wall of photographs, or the worn piano, or the narrow bed. They would never read the words he wrote at 3 in the morning, trying to make sense of a life that had given him everything except peace. That's the story, not the legend, not the concerts, not the movies, or the gold records, or the screaming crowds. Just a room, a wall of photographs, a journal filled with words that were never meant to be read, and a man who had everything the world could offer, sitting alone in the darkness, talking to his mother's ghost, trying to remember who he was before the world decided who he should be. That's the weight of a crown. That's the loneliness of being loved by millions. And that's why Elvis built a room nobody knew. Because everyone needs a place where they can stop being a legend and start being themselves. Even the king of rock and roll. Especially the king of rock and roll.